Black grandmother's recipe book reveals surprising legacy. What do you mean this house isn't ours? Eleanor Davis slammed her hand on the worn recipe book, its pages fluttering in protest. Her voice echoed through the kitchen where generations of her family had gathered. My grandmother cooked in this kitchen for 60 years. My mother was born in the bedroom upstairs. The lawyer across the table adjusted his glasses nervously. Mrs. Davis, according to these records, your grandmother Ruby was never the legal owner. She was. He hesitated. The household cook for the Montgomery family. This property has always belonged to them. Eleanor's daughter Camille gasped, gripping the edge of the kitchen table. That's impossible. Grandma Ruby owned this house. Everyone knew that. James, Eleanor's son, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You're telling us our entire family history is a lie. That we have to leave our home in 2 weeks. The recipe book lay open between them, its yellowed pages covered in Ruby's flowing handwriting. But it wasn't just recipes on those pages. Hidden between instructions for sweet potato pie and cornbread were cryptic notes, names, dates, and what looked like account numbers. I found something, whispered Camille, pulling out a folded paper tucked in the back of the recipe book. As she unfolded it, a faded photograph fell out showing Ruby standing proudly beside a white woman in front of this very house. On the back, written in unfamiliar handwriting, "The truth is in the basement. Look behind the third brick from the left, second row from the bottom." Eleanor stared at the photograph, her world crumbling around her. Everything she thought she knew about her family, her grandmother, this house, it was all suddenly in question. "Mr. Peterson," she said to the lawyer, her voice finding new resolve, "before you tell me I need to leave my family home, I think there's something in the basement we all need to see. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Eleanor arrived at her grandmother's house for what she thought would be a simple meeting about inheritance paperwork. Eleanor pulled into the driveway of the 2-story Victorian home where she'd spent countless childhood Sundays. The white paint was peeling in places. The wraparound porch sagged slightly on the east side. But to Eleanor, it was still the most beautiful house in Westfield, Georgia. Her grandmother Ruby had passed away 3 months ago at the age of 98, and the wound still felt fresh. Today was supposed to bring closure. Mr. Peterson, the family lawyer, was meeting her to finalize the transfer of the house into Eleanor's name. At 65, recently retired from her position as high school principal, Eleanor had been the obvious choice to inherit Ruby's home. Her children, James and Camille, were coming to support her through what everyone expected would be a straightforward but emotional process. Eleanor turned off the engine of her 1985 Buick. Ruby had always admired that car, and sat for a moment, collecting herself. The oak trees that lined the property swayed in the gentle spring breeze, casting dappled shadows across the yard where she had played as a child. She grabbed her purse and the cardboard box from the passenger seat. Inside was Ruby's recipe book, which Eleanor had been keeping at her own home since the funeral. Something had told her to bring it today. As she walked up the cracked concrete path to the house, she noticed Camille's red Honda already parked on the street. Her daughter was always punctual, a trait she'd inherited from Ruby, not from Eleanor. "Mom," Camille called from the porch, waving. At 42, Camille had Ruby's high cheekbones and warm brown eyes. She worked as a nurse at the county hospital, a demanding job that left little time for visits, making today all the more special. "Hi, sweetheart," Eleanor said, climbing the steps and embracing her daughter. "Is your brother here yet?" Camille rolled her eyes affectionately. "What do you think?" "He texted that he's running 15 minutes late. Something about a client meeting running over." James, at 45, was the successful one, a corporate attorney in Atlanta who drove a Mercedes and wore suits that cost more than Eleanor's monthly pension. He'd moved away from their small town as soon as he could, seeking bigger opportunities than Westfield could offer. "Well, let's go inside," Eleanor said, fishing the key from her purse. "Mr. Peterson should be here soon." The key turned in the lock with a familiar resistance. You had to push and lift slightly to get it to work properly. The door swung open with a creak that Eleanor could have recognized blindfolded. The scent hit her immediately, a mixture of cinnamon, old books, and the lavender sachets Ruby had placed in every drawer and closet. For a moment, Eleanor could almost believe her grandmother was still there, puttering around in the kitchen or reading in her favorite armchair by the window. "It still smells like her," Camille said quietly, closing the door behind them. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. She placed the box containing the recipe book on the entryway table and ran her fingers along the wallpaper in the hallway, faded floral patterns that had been there since the 1970s. They made their way to the kitchen, the heart of the house. Ruby had spent most of her time here, creating dishes that had made her famous throughout the county. Her coconut cake had won the state fair competition 5 years running in the 1960s, and her fried chicken recipe was so coveted that the local diner owner had offered to buy it from her, an offer Ruby had refused with a laugh and a wave of her hand. The kitchen had been modernized somewhat in the 1980s Harvest Gold appliances that were now vintage in their own right, but the large wooden table in the center remained the same. It was around this table that 4 generations of their family had gathered for Sunday dinners, holiday celebrations, and late-night confidences. "Remember when Grandma taught us how to make biscuits?" Camille asked, running her hand along the worn surface of the table. Eleanor smiled. "She always said your biscuits were better than mine. Light as clouds," she called them. "That's because you manhandle the dough, Mom. Grandma said you have to treat it gentle, like a baby's bottom." They both laughed, the sound echoing in the empty kitchen. The doorbell rang, breaking the moment. "That must be Mr. Peterson," Eleanor said, straightening her blouse as she walked back toward the entryway. The lawyer stood on the porch, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that looked as old as he was. Mr. Peterson had been handling the Davis family's legal matters since before Eleanor was born. "Mrs. Davis," he said, nodding formally. "And Miss Camille, good to see you both." "Come in, Mr. Peterson," Eleanor said, ushering him inside. "Can I get you some tea? I brought some of Ruby's peach tea mix." "That would be lovely," the lawyer said, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "No one made tea like Ruby." As they settled in the kitchen with Mr. Peterson arranging papers on the table, the front door opened again. "Hello, Mom, Camille," James's voice called from the entryway. "In the kitchen," Eleanor responded. James appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit despite the Georgia heat. He'd loosened his tie slightly, his one concession to being back home. "Mr. Peterson," he said, extending his hand. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic from Atlanta was worse than expected." "Not a problem, James. We were just getting started." James took a seat at the table, placing his sleek leather portfolio beside him. Even in his childhood home, he carried himself with the air of someone in a boardroom. Eleanor felt a familiar pang, wishing her son could relax, could be the boy who once built forts in the backyard and ate Ruby's blackberry cobbler with juice staining his chin. "Now," Mr. Peterson began, adjusting his glasses, "I've prepared the deed transfer documents as we discussed. Once these are signed, the house will officially belong to Eleanor Davis." Eleanor nodded, feeling a mixture of sadness and responsibility. This house had been the center of their family universe for as long as anyone could remember. Ruby had raised Eleanor here after her own mother, Ruby's daughter, had died young from pneumonia. Later, Eleanor had brought her children here every Sunday for dinner, continuing the tradition even after her husband left when James was 12 and Camille was 9. "Before we sign," Eleanor said, "I brought something." She retrieved the box from the entryway and placed it on the table. From it, she carefully lifted Ruby's recipe book. It wasn't a printed cookbook, but a large, leather-bound volume with pages added over decades. Ruby had started it as a young woman and continued adding recipes, notes, and memories until her handwriting became shaky in her final years. "I thought we might want this here," Eleanor explained. "It feels like a part of the house." Camille smiled, reaching for the book. "I was hoping to copy some of these recipes, especially the lemon chess pie." "Take your time with that," Mr. Peterson said unexpectedly. Something in his tone made Eleanor look up sharply. The lawyer was fidgeting with his pen, not meeting her eyes. "Mr. Peterson," she said slowly. "Is something wrong?" The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Davis, I'm afraid there's been a complication with the inheritance." James straightened in his chair. "What kind of complication?" The will was clear. Grandma Ruby left the house to Mom. "Yes, that was her intention," Mr. Peterson agreed. "However, in preparing the final documents, I discovered an issue with the property records." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. "I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to resolve this, hoping I wouldn't have to bring it to your attention, but—" "Just tell us what's going on," Eleanor said, her stomach tightening with apprehension. Mr. Peterson opened the folder. "According to the county records, this house never legally belonged to Ruby Davis." The kitchen fell silent. "That's ridiculous," James said finally. "Grandma lived here for almost 70 years. "Yes, she did," Mr. Peterson agreed. "But according to these documents, the house has always been owned by the Montgomery family. There's no record of it ever being transferred to Ruby." "The Montgomerys?" Camille asked. "As in the banking family, the ones with that big house on Hill Street," Mr. Peterson nodded. "The very same." According to these records, Ruby was employed by the Montgomery family from 1943 until 1975. "Employed?" Eleanor repeated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. My grandmother wasn't anybody's employee. She was a businesswoman. She catered events all over the county. Everyone knew Ruby's kitchen. Yes, she did establish that business, Mr. Peterson acknowledged. In the 1960s, but before that she worked for the Montgomerys as their cook and housekeeper. Eleanor shook her head. That can't be right. This was her house. She told me stories about buying it, about how proud she was to own her own home at a time when not many black women could. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Mr. Peterson slid a document across the table. It was a deed from 1940 listing Edward Montgomery as the owner of 1423 Maple Street, this very address. There's more, he said, his voice grave. The current Montgomery heir Edward's grandson Richard has learned about this discrepancy. He's filed for possession of the property. Possession? James's voice rose. You mean he wants to take our family home? Legally, it appears to be the Montgomery family home, Mr. Peterson corrected gently. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this. Richard Montgomery has given you 2 weeks to vacate the premises. 2 weeks, Eleanor felt lightheaded. To leave the house my grandmother lived in for 7 decades, the house where I grew up, where my children grew up visiting. This is outrageous, James said, standing up. I'll file an injunction today. Adverse possession laws, I've already looked into that, Mr. Peterson interrupted. There's documentation of verbal agreements between the Montgomerys and Ruby. She acknowledged their ownership at various points. It complicates an adverse possession claim. Eleanor stared at the recipe book on the table, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. How could her grandmother, strong, independent Ruby, have lived in a house that wasn't hers? Why would she have pretended otherwise? There must be some mistake, Camille said, placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. Grandma Ruby wouldn't have lied to us about something so important. Eleanor flipped open the recipe book, seeking comfort in the familiar handwriting. Ruby's recipe for buttermilk biscuits was on the first page, the paper stained and well used. 2 cups of flour sifted. Handle with care, not like you're wrestling a gator. As she turned the pages, Eleanor noticed something odd. Between recipes for fried green tomatoes and pecan pie were notes that had nothing to do with cooking. Names, dates, amounts of money. She'd always assumed they were catering records, but looking at them now. Mom, what is it? James asked, noticing her expression. These notes, Eleanor said slowly, they're not about recipes. She turned the book so the others could see. Look at this, EM $250, June 1953. And here, payment received $300, Christmas bonus 1957. Mr. Peterson leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. EM could be Edward Montgomery. So these are, what, payment records? Camille asked. From when Grandma worked for them. Eleanor continued turning pages, the entries becoming more frequent in the 1960s. Here's one that says agreement amended 1964, $75 monthly for maintenance and property tax. It sounds like some kind of arrangement, Mr. Peterson said thoughtfully. Perhaps Ruby was paying the Montgomerys to live in the house. But why wouldn't she just buy it outright? James asked. Especially later when her catering business was successful. Eleanor shook her head, confusion giving way to determination. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. She looked up at Mr. Peterson. This house has been our family home for generations. There must be more to the story. Wait, Camille said suddenly, reaching for the recipe book. Let me see something. She flipped to the back pages where Ruby had tucked miscellaneous notes and clippings. I remember Grandma kept important things in here, not just recipes. She carefully examined the binding, then gently pulled at what appeared to be a pocket in the back cover. From it, she extracted a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. What is that? Eleanor asked. Camille unfolded it carefully. It was a letter, the handwriting elegant and flowing, not Ruby's familiar script. It's dated September 15, 1975, Camille said, scanning the contents. It's signed Margaret Montgomery. Edward's wife, Mr. Peterson supplied. Camille began to read aloud. My dearest Ruby, as I face the end of my days, I find myself reflecting on our long association. When Edward brought you into our home in 1943, I could never have imagined how essential you would become, not just to the running of our household, but to my very existence. The arrangement we discussed regarding the house on Maple Street remains as we agreed. While legal complications prevent me from transferring the deed to you directly, know that in my heart, the house is yours. The monthly payments you've insisted on making these past 11 years are unnecessary, but speak to your character and pride. Edward never understood our friendship, bound as he was by the conventions of our time. But you and I know what we mean to each other, especially after you saved Thomas during the scarlet fever when no doctor would come. I have instructed Richard to honor our arrangement after my passing. The papers in the basement safe should ensure this, though I know my son has his father's stubbornness. With eternal gratitude and affection, Margaret Montgomery. As Camille finished reading, a photograph slipped from between the folds of the letter. It showed Ruby standing proudly beside an elegant white woman in front of this very house. Both women were smiling, their arms linked in a way that suggested genuine affection rather than employer and employee. Eleanor picked up the photograph, turning it over. On the back was written, "The truth is in the basement. Look behind the third brick from the left, second row from the bottom." "The basement?" James asked. "What does that mean?" "Ruby always kept the basement locked," Eleanor said slowly. "She said it was just storage and too dangerous with the steep stairs. I don't think I've been down there more than a handful of times in my life." "Do you have the key?" Camille asked. Eleanor nodded. "It should be on the key ring. Let's go see what Grandma Ruby was hiding." As they prepared to descend to the basement, the narrative catches up to the opening scene where we began. "Mr. Peterson," Eleanor said to the lawyer, her voice finding new resolve, "before you tell me I need to leave my family home, I think there's something in the basement we all need to see." Lawyer looked hesitant. "Mrs. Davis, I understand this is difficult, but legally speaking, just come with us," James interrupted, his attorney instincts activated. "If there's evidence that contradicts the Montgomery claim, you should witness it firsthand." The basement door was at the end of the hallway, a heavy wooden door that had always been kept locked. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she inserted the old iron key. It turned with resistance, the lock mechanisms rusty from disuse. The door opened to reveal narrow wooden stairs descending into darkness. Eleanor fumbled for the light switch on the wall, and a single bare bulb illuminated the staircase. "Be careful," she warned as they began their descent. "These stairs are steep." The basement was cooler than the rest of the house, the air heavy with the scent of earth and old paper. Unlike the tidy rooms upstairs, this space was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and trunks. A layer of dust covered everything, suggesting that even Ruby had rarely ventured down here in her later years. "Where do we start?" Camille asked, looking around at the overwhelming collection of family history. Eleanor held up the photograph. "Third brick from the left, second row from the bottom." She moved toward the far wall where the foundation was exposed brick. "It must be here." The wall was damp with patches of moss growing in spots. Eleanor counted carefully, then pointed to a specific brick. "This one," James stepped forward. "Let me." He pressed against the brick, which moved slightly under his touch. He worked it loose carefully until it came free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a metal box, roughly the size of a hardcover book. James pulled it out, brushing away cobwebs. "It's locked," he said, examining the small padlock securing the box. "The key," Camille suggested. "Check if it's the same key as the basement door." Eleanor tried the iron key in her hand. It didn't fit. "Wait," she said, a memory surfacing. "Ruby always wore a small key on a chain around her neck. I asked her about it once, and she said it was the key to her secrets." Eleanor had assumed it was just one of her grandmother's poetic expressions. "It must be among her personal effects." "I have them," Camille said. "After the funeral, I packed up her bedroom. The box is upstairs in the guest room." They climbed back up the stairs, leaving Mr. Peterson in the kitchen reviewing his documents with a troubled expression. In the guest room, Camille retrieved a cardboard box labeled Ruby's personal items and began searching through it. "Here," she said after a moment, holding up a delicate silver chain with a small key dangling from it. "She was wearing this when she passed." Back in the basement, the key fit perfectly into the padlock. With a satisfying click, it opened. Eleanor took a deep breath before lifting the lid of the box. Inside were several folded documents, a small journal, and another photograph, this one older than the first, showing a much younger Ruby with a white infant in her arms. She was standing beside the same woman from the earlier photograph, though Margaret Montgomery appeared to be in her 20s or early 30s in this image. James carefully lifted out the documents. "These are legal papers," he said, his professional expertise evident as he scanned them. "It's a private deed." He looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and excitement. "It's for this house dated 1975. It shows Margaret Montgomery transferring ownership to Ruby Davis with specific conditions." "What conditions?" Eleanor asked. "It says the transfer is contingent upon services rendered to the Montgomery family, including but not limited to the saving of Thomas Montgomery's life in 1947. James continued reading. "It states that while the official county deed would remain in the Montgomery name during Ruby's lifetime for reasons specified in a separate agreement, upon Ruby's death, the house would transfer fully and legally to her descendants." "So the house is ours." Camille asked. According to this, yes, James confirmed. It's signed by Margaret Montgomery and witnessed by a notary. It's a legitimate private deed. Eleanor took the document, her hands shaking slightly. But why keep this hidden? Why didn't Grandma Ruby tell us? The journal in the box might hold answers. Eleanor opened it carefully, the fragile pages crinkling beneath her fingers. It was Ruby's handwriting, dated entries beginning in 1943. September 3, 1943, Eleanor read aloud. Today I began work at the Montgomery house. Mrs. M seems kind, though Mr. M barely looks at me. The war has taken most of the men who would normally do this work, so colored women like me have opportunities we never had before. Still, I keep my eyes down and my mouth shut. $5 a week is more than most are making. She turned several pages forward. December 18, 1947. Thomas has recovered completely from the fever. Dr. Williams still won't acknowledge that my poultice saved the child when his medicine failed. Mrs. M knows, though. She held my hands today and wept, saying she owes me a debt she can never repay. Mr. M gave me a $50 Christmas bonus and looked me in the eye for the first time in 4 years. More pages, more entries. Ruby documented her relationship with the Montgomery family through the changing decades. The civil rights movement, the challenges of being a black woman in the South, the slow evolution of her relationship with Margaret Montgomery from employer-employee to something approaching friendship. May 2, 1964. Eleanor continued reading, her voice growing stronger. Margaret offered me the house on Maple Street today. Edward has been gone 3 years now, and she says she no longer cares about appearances. I refuse to take it as charity. We've arranged that I'll make monthly payments, small ones she insisted, and live there as if it's mine. Someday, she promises, it truly will be. For now, this arrangement protects us both. A white woman publicly giving property to her black housekeeper would cause talk neither of us needs. So that's why, James said softly. It was about protecting Grandma Ruby's dignity and Mrs. Montgomery's reputation. Eleanor nodded, continuing to scan the journal. Here's an entry from 1975. Margaret is failing. The doctors give her weeks, perhaps days. Today she had her lawyer draw up papers regarding the house. She's found a way to ensure it comes to me and my family eventually, though for now it must remain registered to the Montgomerys. Richard doesn't approve, he has his father's views on such matters, but he's agreed to honor his mother's wishes, at least while she lives. Richard, Camille repeated. That's the same Richard Montgomery who's trying to evict us now. His grandson, actually, Mr. Peterson said from the basement stairs. He had followed them down during their discovery. The Richard mentioned in that journal would be around 90 now. This claim is being made by his grandson, Richard Montgomery III. But these documents, James said, holding up the private deed. They prove the house should transfer to us now that Grandma Ruby has passed. Mr. Peterson took the document, examining it carefully. This appears to be a legitimate private transfer agreement. It wouldn't have been registered with the county, probably deliberately, based on what you're reading from the journal, but it's a binding contract between parties. He looked up. I believe this would hold up in court, especially with the supporting evidence in Ruby's journal. Eleanor was only half listening. She had continued reading Ruby's journal, her heart pounding as family secrets were revealed. Listen to this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. April 12, 1980. Richard visited today, still angry about the house arrangement. He threatened to contest his mother's decision after I'm gone. I showed him the letters, the ones that prove Thomas isn't Edward's son. Margaret and I protected that secret for 33 years. Richard may despise me, but he won't risk the Montgomery name being tarnished. Sometimes protection comes from unexpected places. The basement fell silent as the implications of Ruby's words sank in. Are you saying, Camille began, Thomas Montgomery isn't Edward Montgomery's biological son, Eleanor finished. And Ruby and Margaret kept that secret. Thomas would be Richard II's father, Mr. Peterson said slowly. The current Richard's grandfather. Which means the current Richard Montgomery's claim to this house, to the Montgomery fortune, could be complicated by this revelation, James said, his legal mind working quickly. There's more, Eleanor said, turning to the final pages of the journal. Ruby's last entry, dated just a year before she died. I've made peace with my arrangement with the Montgomerys. This house has been my home in truth, if not in public record. When I'm gone, the private deed Margaret prepared will ensure my Eleanor and her children keep this place where our family has grown and thrived. Richard's son has no interest in this modest house, focused as he is on the Montgomery banking business. But should any challenge arise, I've preserved Margaret's letters. They remain where they've always been, safe in the recipe book that no Montgomery would ever think to examine. Eleanor looked up from the journal. The recipe book. There must be more hidden in it. They returned to the kitchen, where the recipe book still lay open on the table. Eleanor began examining it more carefully, paying attention to the binding, the cover, the spaces between pages. Here, she said finally, noticing that several pages in the middle section were stuck together. Carefully, she separated them, revealing an envelope sealed within. Inside were letters written in the same elegant hand as the note they'd found earlier. These are from Margaret to Ruby, Eleanor said, scanning them. Spanning decades, she pulled out one in particular. This one mentions Thomas. It's dated 1944, 9 months before Thomas's birth. The letter was brief but clear. Margaret confessed to Ruby that she had become involved with someone while Edward was away fighting in the war. She was pregnant and terrified of the consequences. Ruby had helped her conceal the truth. So Thomas Montgomery, the heir to the Montgomery fortune, Richard's father, wasn't actually a Montgomery by blood, James said. Which means, Mr. Peterson added thoughtfully, that the current Richard Montgomery's claim to the Montgomery assets, including this house, could be legally questionable. We don't need to expose all that old history, Eleanor said firmly. Ruby kept these secrets for a reason. All we need is to show that Margaret intended for us to have this house after Ruby's passing. The private deed should be sufficient, Mr. Peterson agreed, with the journal entries as supporting evidence of the arrangement's longevity and Margaret's clear intent. James was already taking photographs of the documents with his phone. I'll file a counterclaim immediately. The current Richard Montgomery probably has no idea these documents exist. Should we contact him directly? Camille suggested. Maybe once he sees these papers, he'll withdraw his claim without a court battle. Eleanor considered this. Ruby and Margaret protected each other. They found a way to help each other despite the barriers society placed between them. Maybe we should at least try to resolve this peacefully first. Mr. Peterson nodded. I know Richard, He's not unreasonable, just protective of what he believes is his family legacy. I could arrange a meeting. Do that, Eleanor decided. But make copies of everything first. If he won't listen to reason, we'll be prepared to fight. The meeting was set for the following day at the Montgomery Bank building downtown. Eleanor brought Ruby's recipe book, the journal, and the private deed. James accompanied her, dressed in his most intimidating attorney attire, while Camille stayed at the house, continuing to search for any additional evidence they might need. Richard Montgomery was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps in his early 40s, about James's age. He had the polished look of old money, but his expression was more curious than hostile as they entered his office. Mrs. Davis, he said, rising from behind an imposing mahogany desk. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I understand this situation has been distressing. Mr. Montgomery, Eleanor replied evenly. This is my son, James Davis. He's an attorney. Richard nodded to James. Mr. Peterson mentioned you'd be joining us. I hope we can resolve this matter amicably. That depends, James said, on whether you're willing to recognize our family's right to the house on Maple Street. Richard gestured for them to sit. I'm afraid it's not that simple. According to county records don't tell the whole story, Eleanor interrupted, placing Ruby's recipe book on the desk. My grandmother and your great-grandmother had an arrangement that goes beyond what's in the public record. She explained the discovery of the private deed, the journal entries, and the decades-long understanding between Ruby and Margaret. As she spoke, she noticed Richard's expression changing from confident to uncertain. I wasn't aware of any private agreement, he said finally. My grandfather occasionally mentioned that Ruby Davis had some special arrangement with my great-grandmother, but he never elaborated. I assumed it was simply a long-term employment situation. It was much more than that, Eleanor said firmly. She handed him the private deed. This document clearly states that upon Ruby's death, the house transfers to her descendants. Richard examined the deed carefully. This appears authentic, but why wasn't it ever recorded with the county? You know why, Eleanor said quietly. In 1975, a wealthy white woman officially transferring property to her black former employee would have caused talk. They chose to handle it privately for both their sakes. Richard was silent for a moment, still studying the document. My grandfather never mentioned this deed. Perhaps he didn't know about it, James suggested, or perhaps he chose to forget it. There's more, Eleanor said, hesitating only briefly before continuing. Ruby's journal and letters from your great-grandmother suggest there were family secrets that both women protected. Ruby kept those secrets until her death, and we're prepared to do the same unless you force us to use everything at our disposal to defend our home. Richard looked up sharply. What secrets? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Secrets that might call into question the very foundation of the Montgomery legacy. Your great-grandmother and my grandmother had a bond that went beyond employer and employee. They protected each other. I think we should honor that by finding a peaceful resolution. Richard was silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the desk. Finally, he sighed. I never met Ruby Davis, but my father spoke of her often. He said she was the backbone of the household when he was growing up, that she made the best peach cobbler in Georgia. Eleanor smiled despite herself. Her secret was nutmeg, just a pinch. Look, Richard said, I have no personal attachment to the house on Maple Street. When our legal department flagged the property as still technically belonging to the Montgomery Trust, I simply followed standard procedure. But this, he gestured to the deed and the recipe book, this changes things. So you'll withdraw your claim? James asked. I'll do better than that, Richard decided. I'll have our attorneys draw up proper transfer documents, making the house officially yours in the county records. It's time to honor the arrangement our grandmothers made. Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. Richard hesitated, then asked, these secrets you mentioned, how damaging are they? Eleanor thought about the letters revealing Thomas Montgomery's true parentage, about the decades of deception that had protected the Montgomery name and allowed Ruby to provide for her family. They're in the past, she said finally. And that's where they should stay, don't you think? Richard nodded, relief evident in his expression. I agree. The past has its own way of protecting itself. As they prepared to leave, Richard asked unexpectedly, the recipe book, would you consider sharing some of those recipes? My father always talked about Ruby's cooking. Eleanor smiled. I think Ruby would like that. Sharing food was her way of bringing people together across all kinds of boundaries. 1 week later, Eleanor, James, and Camille gathered once more in Ruby's kitchen, now officially the Davis family kitchen. Mr. Peterson had delivered the new deed that morning, registered with the county and irrefutable. I still can't believe it, Camille said, running her hand along the worn kitchen table. Grandma Ruby and Mrs. Montgomery forming this bond that protected both of them through all those years. Different times, Eleanor said, flipping through the recipe book. They found a way to help each other despite everything working against them. What will you do with the house now? James asked. It needs a lot of work. Eleanor looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the outdated appliances, the worn floorboards that creaked in familiar places. Fix it up little by little, make it a home for our family again, she smiled at her children. Ruby would want that. Speaking of Ruby, Camille said, pulling a plate from the oven, I tried my hand at her peach cobbler, with the nutmeg just like she taught us. The familiar scent filled the kitchen, bringing with it a flood of memories. As they sat around the table, sharing the dessert and stories of Ruby, Eleanor felt her grandmother's presence all around them. You know, she said, in a way this recipe book really did reveal Ruby's legacy, not just the legal right to this house, but the story of two women who found a way to transcend the boundaries of their time. That's worth more than any property deed. James raised his glass. To Grandma Ruby and Margaret Montgomery. And to secrets kept and revealed at just the right time, Camille added. Eleanor smiled, looking around at the kitchen where generations had gathered, where secrets had been hidden in plain sight, and where her family would continue to create memories for years to come. To home, she said simply, in all its complicated glory. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.